Hello everyone! Let's see, has this been running like it's supposed to? Has it been running like it's supposed to? It has been. That's good. Has that been running like it's supposed to? It has been. Hello everyone and welcome to Attacking Pearl Harbour. Decisions that led to the Japanese planning. Well, their choices and everything else. Hello everyone, how are we all doing? How goes the world? How's everyone doing on Twitch? You know, Jonathan Moon, Paul Amos, Leslie, hello. Hello to everyone on YouTube. Paul, Leslie, Nyoku4472, Mark Hartness, DG40, Stephen Meyer, a Squidward Feel, hello. And Prince of Tonga, hello everyone. Hello Night6831, hello everyone who's there, everyone who's waiting. Peter Dawson, hello to all. Now, before I start, I have been reminded by someone of something, so if you don't mind, I do have to quickly sort something out. You want your second food pot, don't you? You do. Sorry. It's a hot day. He hasn't had a walk because it's so hot, but he seems to be eating everything in sight, so I'm going to get him another food pot before we start. You're a funny fluff, you really are. No, we're not able to take you for a wander because, honestly, it's just too hot outside. I'll have to drive you to somewhere which is cooler later tonight. Oh, that'll be fun. Walking the poodle. I can highly recommend this to everyone. Taking your dog for a walk at 1 AM in the morning is a brilliant exercise. They find it very lovely. The foxes find it quite confusing. And everyone else is sort of going, what the frigot's going on? Ooh, 2 Japanese meals in a week. Wow, that's a lucky time for you, Leslie. Hello, Ed E. Rudolph. And hello, Very Silent Mouse. So, pretty much, today's topic started off because I was looking through the future of this channel. And the future of this channel, of course, is charting out the videos and when they're coming out. And you might have noticed that now with the patron premieres being added in, as you know, a couple of Saturdays a month of patron premieres, the ones which get third and fourth in the vote, for the patron vote, because I got something else coming up long term for Wednesdays. You might have noticed that sort of going, well, hang on Alex, this is getting quite a long way ahead on the Saturday videos. They are starting to be plotted out and you're now into December. Specifically, this video will go live as a premiere on the 7th of December, the recorded version of it. So today you get the live version of it. It seemed appropriate. It seemed appropriate. And it is very much about leadership and fitting with the year of leadership. So, let's start off with why Pearl Harbour? Well, why not? Pearl Harbour is a gorgeous place. It is. It's a wonderful place. It also sits pretty much slam bang in the middle of the Pacific, in the middle of several crucial trading routes go past it. It is a critical juncture for American resources in the region, for anyone's resources in the region. So Pearl Harbour, by its nature, becomes indelibly and ineffably a fulcrum point of any war in the Pacific. But it wasn't always this way. It wasn't always this way. The US Navy was usually based in San Diego. That was where their major bases were. That is where their major focus of operations were. The US Navy had come from San Diego. They'd come from the west coast of the United States and moved to Pearl Harbor. And one of the things that interests me when we're talking about Pearl Harbour as an operation and planning is the exact time when the Japanese first start planning to launch operations against Pearl Harbour. Because you see, I have a theory. And my theory is that the Japanese were planning Pearl Harbour for a lot longer than a lot of the official histories will tell you. Why? Because I think the thing is, when we've been asking questions about Pearl Harbour, I think everyone's been looking at it from the perspective of planning the specific operation. Not the concept of operations, not the long-term studies of operations, the specific operation. And I will concede the specific operation, the attack that takes place on the 7th of December 1941, probably started planning in January 1941. But just as with the operation that leads to the strike on Taranto, started planning in about April 1940, realistically, they start doing the solid planning. They've had that concept of operations written up as a plan for the best part of a decade and a half by the time it's actually enacted. In other words, the British have had a notified, standardized concept of operations for an airstrike by carriers on Taranto since about 1925. Because it's what you do as an professional armed forces. You do that. And that's Britain. That of the British Empire, along with the US, are the two largest powers, the ones with the most resources and infrastructure to be able to adapt to events. And they have plans and concepts of operations. Are you going to honestly tell me that a nation like Japan, which has been weakened to the point it has by the naval treaties, which has not been allowed the 70% it wanted, has been given just a 60% ratio, is not going to have started planning the very moment they were in that situation, and have an ongoing cycle of planning and concepts of operations going on from the moment even the World War I ends? Now, the interesting thing is, as we're talking about, there are accounts of discussions in 1934, discussions in 1938, and I'll be talking about those. But I would still contest it starts off much, much earlier. And there is more than just my strong suspicions to back this up. There is. That's the fact that what we're talking about with a raid on a fleet in harbour is being nothing new. Nothing new at all. It's one of those scenarios where you start looking at the history of World War I and you find it going through it inexorably. The Royal Navy is constantly looking at it, and you cannot tell me that the Japanese naval attaches, the Japanese observers, the people who are working inside the Royal Navy, they have them in World War I, they have them in World War II, taking notes on what was going on, did not have sight of the plans and the concepts of operations which were focused around Wilhelmshaven, which built upon the success, well, the theoretical success of the Cuxhaven raid on 25th December 1914, and were developing such things as the Sopwith Cuckoos. You know, the Japanese were just as involved in all this scenario. They were just as involved. And they're watching us all. You have to remember, the Japanese in World War I are some of the first to use naval aviation, are some of the first to push it through. And both Japan and the Royal Navy have a history of attacking enemy fleets in harbour. It's a natural scenario. It's what you do. Again, Mirza al-Kabir and Taranto do not come from nowhere. The Royal Navy doctrine on attacking fleets in harbour and hitting them when they cannot hit back, because when it is in harbour, a fleet is at its most exposed and its weakest point. It's been part of the Royal Navy for a very, very long time. Yes, they have different tones of the operations. One started out as an attempt to get an ally to go to friendly, safe territory so that you didn't have to do it, but then turned into it. And one was, from the get-go, gonna be it. So, this doesn't come from nowhere. It's sometimes the most difficult thing to get across in any discussion of Pearl Harbour. The fact that Pearl Harbour and the strike on Pearl Harbour is not very surprising. You know, the reason I don't agree with the conspiracy theories around Pearl Harbour is they rely on people being smart when people normally are not. And certainly those persons involved never rise to that level of intelligence again needed to do that. The reality is it's all short-term politics and ego. It really is, because from any practical point of view, Pearl Harbour is a natural place for the Japanese to target. And again, there's a lot of American ego, and one of the things I will do in this video is I will, after we've done the Shaman's book plug, we'll turn to how the Americans would attack Pearl Harbour. But I would say I find a lot of the American cracks about the Japanese copying their plans for their raids that they carried out in the various fleet problems to be very much a self-serving ego trip. It's kind of like when people say they copied Taranto. They didn't. The Japanese were planning this a lot longer than the Americans had that exercise and that attack. The Japanese had plans a lot earlier. And yes, did they refine it with information they got from there? Yes. But no one sensible would copy that plan, because in a nice way, they would presume, after you'd had that experience of being devastated on a Sunday frigating morning because no one was out of their frigating beds, that someone would have done something about it. So yes. Hello Jacob, hello Verdun, hello Peter Dawson and Dave Harrison. Hello everyone. We're going to do a bit more of hellos because, you know, some people seem to be joining us now. Hi Leslie, it's just not baseball. No. I only say interest, more like confirming our own eyes. Honestly, Mark, that wasn't in relation to what you wrote in the chat. I've just spotted what you wrote in the chat now. I have my own notes next to the chat, so if the eyes look like they're in the same place, that's because my notes are there and the chat's there, and they're literally next to each other as two long lines. One's a line of bullet points, one's a flickering line of chat going up. The fact it coincided was happy accident. It makes me look like I'm more involved in the chat than I was at the time. Hi Felix B. It's Lions. Yeah, it's not baseball, Leslie. It's not cricket. It is what you do in war. It is how you act, how you do the role you're gonna do. And it's a fun piece of history. But it's also a fact that you have a lot of convergent ideas going on. That's the interesting thing to me, because if you start looking at it, the Royal Navy, the US Navy, and the Imperial Japanese Navy, and to an extent the French, all develop a similar harbour strike doctrine with their carriers. All develop a similar harbour strike doctrine with their carriers. Why? And there's two reasons. One, if you want to carry out a strike on the enemy when it's most devastating, you want them to be at their lowest level of readiness. They're always going to be at their lowest level of readiness in port. because that's their safe space. It's one of the reasons why I often tell people, be careful of the jokes you make at home with your family. Because people let their guards down when they're at home. So that's when you have to be sort of more on your game. You joke away with family, that's fine. The family enjoy it. But you have to spot your family members, and you know where are the lines you can't push on what days. Because sometimes they're lower ebb than others. The thing is, their port is their safe space. It's their home spot. The other advantage from a naval aviation perspective is that it is a very easy navigation point to get to. You see, it gives you a fixed point. A harbour's a geographically known location. You can aim for it. You can do a long-range flight to it. And you will know where you're going, and you'll be able to get there. And that makes life easy. And finally, I'd say specifically for Japan, when you consider how they have been put at such a disadvantage that they no longer consider a defensive war to be a viable option, they are left only with offensive action. They are left only with attack. You see, the thing is, the Americans won Washington, is what they would claim, against, as often said, actually, the people who really win the Washington Naval Treaty, if anyone does, is Italy. It really is Italy. For France, it's a devastating blow. For Britain and America, it's a devastating blow in many, many ways. And for Japan, it's a terrible blow. But Italy gets, we've got parity with the French and we have to do nothing about it. And we have great power status because we're part of this group. It's just a win-win-win for the Italians. But the Americans might have won that treaty in terms of the debate with the Japanese getting only 3 to every 5 British or American capital ships or carriers. But by winning it, they fundamentally undermined the Japanese morale. They fundamentally undervalued the Japanese sense of confidence. And it's a really weird thing because, honestly, if you consider the costs that are involved and the fact that the ships they have available and the ships they're likely to get rid of, if you had ended up with a Washington Naval Treaty, which had been 10-7 relationships, where Britain and America each retaining 20 capital ships and the Japanese getting to have 14, and probably the French and Italians getting 8 each. Excuse me. Excuse me. No. 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 That's better. If you had such a scenario where you have that much more force, that much more capability, it doesn't really affect the treaty balance, but it does affect the confidence of France, it does affect the confidence of Japan, and it affects the capabilities of America and Britain in a very real way. It also means that America and Britain probably have a limit of 10 carriers, in which case you're probably going to see a lot of 27,000-ton carriers built, because on that numbers you can afford to build 27,000-ton carriers, which means you have carriers built which are closer to, well, midways and I'm trying to think. The full fat Yorktown designs, which were 27,000 tons, and the Implackables for the Royal Navy. Even the poodle fears the fluffy torpedo. He sometimes goes swimming with me. It's fun. When you have doggy pools and you can take your dog swimming with you, they have a great time. Admittedly, you don't have to deal with wet wool afterwards, but that's why we only go after you've been freshly cut. Less wool to get wet. Also in Japan, you must move forward. The dragonfly principle. Dragonflies can't fly backwards. Yeah. That is true. You have to move forward. You shouldn't have made it by chance. I will always try to be honest. Do you have a Washington Treaty episode from what I have many on the Washington Treaty. I have taken it to pieces and even designed an equitable treaty. Thank you, Januska. Thank you for the lurk. And good luck on the move. So this leads us to the principal characters involved. And oh my lord, are they some characters. Now, this is when things get interesting, because these are by no means an exhaustive list. They really aren't. All the staff officers, all the personalities involved, you're getting into hundreds of people. And that's the other thing which is important, because if you want something to stay secret, okay, it either needs to be so routine no one thinks it's special, i.e. hidden in plain sight, or it has to be a very small group hidden in a very large crowd. Now, that is a fun time. That is a fun time to get into. But this is the thing that always interests me, and this is another reason that adds to my view that, yeah, they've had an ongoing project, planning and thinking about War of America and possible strikes on Pearl Harbour. And they hide it, and they don't necessarily hide it. They have a large group looking at it. A large number of officers, both in the Imperial Japanese, in the Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff, and in the combined fleet. They have multiple senior officers taking close interest and involvement. They have multiple teams of senior officers getting involved. They have multiple planners getting involved. They have staff at a lot of different levels getting involved. Now, I will say, and I will add this, and I'm going to mention this in all the videos I do this in, I want to do a video about ranks, explaining ranks, not just the Japanese ones, which I did in Chuzo Naguma's video, but also in pretty much all the ones, the French, the Dutch, and the other sort of ranks. Now, I've found a good book for the Dutch. I've got a couple of fairly good books on English ranks. I've got a book coming on Japanese ranks, which have been impressed by the reviews of. I've got a book coming on Russian ranks, which I will see how it's good. But I am currently struggling to find a book on French ranks. So if anyone has any suggestions about French ranks, please comment below this video. I would like to have I'm looking for a book on them, so that I can produce a video which is literally going to be ranks of the world's navies explained. Literally that. So things like the fact that, these officers, that Commando Kaigan Chusa Minoru Genda, what does that mean? Well, that means center, middle of the road, big officer. He's at the level at which he's trusted naval officer. Minoru Genda had been discussing the idea of such an attack from 1934, according to his personal memory, and had been used as a sounding board by Yamato Anamishi, a key mind in Japanese naval aviation at the time. He is. He's also one of the people who sent to the UK to go and see how the war is going in the UK and study the performance of the Spitfire and the Hurricane. Now, the thing is, the Japanese had a lot of planning and a lot of work to do to build their put their forces together. They're not just... This is the trouble with planning. People treat planning as just an operational thing. But your concept of operations, your wider strategic concept of operations, drives your procurement. And then what ships and what capabilities you procure drives your planning. It's a never-ending circle. Not always a virtuous circle either. It can be a very negative circle. So you have officers like Commander Minoru Genda involved, because that allows you to basically chart the future, because you've got an officer who is on the track to become a senior aviation officer, maybe even an admiral later on. He's pretty good, he's pretty smart, he's pretty capable, he's fairly good within the wider Navy. If you want to see what your ships are going to look like and be operated by in the future, you've got to talk to him now, because in 20 years' time, he could be in this position. So you're giving him the tools he's going to be using. You're giving him the tools he's going to be using. And he's not the only junior officer involved. Again, you also then have Kaigan Tesia. That's equivalent to sort of captain, naval captain, not army captain. There are some lovely ranks in the Japanese, and when you translate them, some of them come out as Navy captain, and what they mean is lieutenant, not captain, because they are translating the rank as an army rank, because it is, in terms of the Japanese, if it's got Kaigan in front of it, that basically means it's Navy. Okay? If it's not Kaigan in front of it, it's army. And that's this officer here. And he's Yamato's chief of staff and key planning officer. And the things he favours are small task forces. He really does. Why? Because he comes from the attrition side of Japanese strategy. It's one of those wonderful things you learn when you start delving into Japanese strategy. And of course, he says this and he immediately looks for his big book, which he tends to use to drum home about Japanese strategy, and he cannot find it. That is helpful, Alex. That is really... Oh, there it is, right there. Kaigan. Can I get it out? Oh, can I get it out? Oh, that was a lot of work. It's a nice long read. It's the Imperial Japanese Navy from 1887 to 1941. It's by David Evans and Mark Peaty, and it's their strategy, tactics, technology in the Imperial Japanese Navy. And when you start to read something like this, and you start to go through something which has been as well worked up as this has been, and as developed as this has been, you start to realize just how much and how important the Japanese strategies for attrition and for basically naval guerrilla warfare are to their war planning and to shaping their approach to war planning. Small groups, directed closely and closely coordinated by senior officers to achieve maximum effect while being a minimal force to be lost should the worst happen to any of those groups, is a fundamental part of guerrilla warfare and of it being successfully commanded and controlled by a centralized fleet like the Japanese approach. They are not looking at the Swedish model of units and functioning forces which the Finns and the Swedes go with for their sort of style of operations if they're overrun. No, we're talking very, very much a centralized control system. Very silent mouse. Is there a follow-up for Kaigan of 42 to 45? That's an interesting question. There are certainly a lot of books published by Beatty. PT. And there are some books published by Evans. I don't think they've done a joint book for 42 to 45. I don't think they have. But the answer is yes. You never know with those two. They are kind of like my old Professor Andrew Lambert, who has books, and I kid you not, has whole books written sitting below his desk, which he's not sure if he's prepared to send in yet. I used to love going into his office because there was always about 3 or 4 books sitting down there. Good boy. Now, Kameto Kurashima is a really critical person when it comes to understanding Yamato. Because as Chief of Staff, he's his first sounding board, and he's also the person who's charged with most interpreting his vision and putting into reality. Too often, when we talk about Yamamoto, it's everything's put on him, and it's all his ideas, it's all his fault, his planning. And yeah, he's the guy in charge. As I've said before with BT, as I said before with others, the buck has to stop somewhere, it stops with him. But the problem is, and the reality is, it also does factor in his staff. Now, if he'd selected a staff like BT had, with people like Seymour, who weren't qualified for the post, but look good on paper and for social standing, so you get them, then yes, you would have a far stronger case to make against Yamamoto. But he doesn't. He selects officers who are considered very good, very capable staff officers. They might not be necessarily the best leaders for the Japanese Navy, but they are certainly exceptionally good staff officers for the Japanese Navy. And that's what he's pushing. He is a capable officer who is the one who is taking the lead in coordinating these efforts. Prince of Tonga, so essentially controlled task groups rather than a single or split fleet. Yes. This is one of those answers to questions of, we often get into discussions of, why are there vice admirals commanding forces which in other navies would be commanded by a rear admiral? It's because the vice admirals are trusted to lead these combined forces, these mixtures of carriers and the cruisers and destroyers and everything else. Sounds like the dog is cavitating. I don't think he's too hot at the moment, but I think he feels it. He hasn't been able to have a haircut because of his ear infection, so they didn't want him to get wet, but he's going to go have a special cut on Monday, so... if it keeps being hot, he's just going to get hotter and hotter and hotter. By Sunday, you might see him wearing his cool jacket. For brew ships. Now, these are all interesting personnel and capable personnel. Next above that, we have Kaigan Shosho Ryonosuke Kusaka. That's basically equivalent to Rear Admiral. He is the second, the one in the middle here. And he is commander of the 24th Air Flotilla and chief of staff of the Kido Butai. And he is the officer, an aviation specialist officer, who is in charge of planning the actual air attacks. When they are deciding to put it together, he's the one who takes the lead and starts putting the plan together of the operational plan. Consulting with Minoru Genda and other officers, other senior aviation officers, to develop the plan of attack. And they're developing the air plan. One of the interesting things is these are developing the strike plan. When we're talking about developing the fleet maneuver plans, how the route the Kido Butai goes out, etc., those come from this side of the equation more than this side of the equation. Basically, I grouped these two sets into the naval side of the equation and the naval air side of the equation, and how they work together. Now, he's a capable officer. He's an experienced officer. And as Chief of Staff of the Kido Butai, he will execute his plan under Nagumo, who is, of course, the commander of the Kido Butai. And this is the way the Japanese run. The Japanese don't look at the scenario and go, okay, we need to have dedicated aviation professionals to run our carriers. We prefer them. We prefer them to have experience of aviation capabilities. We prefer that. But once you get to a certain level, once you get to the level of equivalent to a Vice Admiral, we expect you to be able to run forces, whether they are made up of carriers, cruisers, or capital ships, or destroyers, or submarines, whatever they are, you are supposed to be able to run them. Now, they also have other issues which are driving this planning process, but let's consider this next officer, Kaigen Shoshu Takahiro Onshi, head of the Aviation Development Division in the Ministry of Munitions. Would argue in some scenarios he is the originator of the plan, or even the idea of the plan, but after gathering all the information together that is necessary for the plan, he becomes a very firm opponent of it, believing it will not achieve what the Japanese need it to achieve, and so he gets transferred to the command of the 11th Air Fleets. So he's out the way. Paul McDonough, I'm not sure what you're talking about there. I just spotted a thing, a raid on Toronto by Royal Air Force. It was done by the Fleet Air Arm, part of the Royal Navy, and it's done by the Japanese Naval aviation units. The Japan didn't have an air force at this point. They had army aviation and naval aviation. They didn't have a separate air force. And Britain had split it up. So, yeah. Yeah. When I do ranks, I probably will do. Will include things like the various roles of chiefs of staff and staff officers. I read it. I'm not sure where you read that idea, but no, they're not copied. And go back to the beginning of the video, and you'll have a full explanation of why it's not copied. But hey ho. There's a lot of people who look at the history and go, well, they do this operation in 1940 and this operation is done in 1941, so they must have copied. No, they've all been planning such strikes since World War I. If it's anything, it's a copy of the Cuxhaven raid in 14th of December 1914, 25th of December 1914. But no, it's not Taranto. Taranto they learn stuff from, but yeah, it's not really the copying point. Now, the thing is about Takahiro Onishi is I think he is key to transitioning from probably what was a raiding concept to a concept which was going to be a full strike. And the reason you transition from a raid is I think the original concepts would have been built around the raid, because the idea would have been to get the Americans to do what War Plan Orange had worked out was going to be an incredibly bad idea. That is, to charge across the Pacific without any heed of what the Japanese and just try to seize the Japanese home islands or something from the west coast of the United States. The Americans had already worked out that was a bad idea. It was a very bad idea. You don't do that. And to not take any, the Japanese have this whole attrition plan, which was the idea was you'd get as the British and the Royal Navy or you know, the Americans got closer, they'd attrit them, and they'd keep on coming, and once they'd attrit them to a level at which they were almost equal, then they'd descend on them in full fighting order with all the support of land-based aviation, carriers, submarines, everything they could, and annihilate them in a Kantai-Kessen. That's when the decisive battle was supposed to take place, and then they would have a negotiated peace, because that's how the British and American roll. And the thing is, the Japanese realize that the problem with their plan, and they do notice, is that it relies on the British and the Americans being stupid. It relies on them keep coming, even when they're losing ships, when they're getting attritted, to keep coming. And that's the problem. The British and the Americans aren't that stupid. They've got their issues. They've got their issues, but they're not that stupid. So how do you make them that stupid? Well, you make them angry. And originally, I wouldn't be surprised if the earlier strikes, the earlier plans, if they exist, involve probably Akagi, not the Amagi class battlecruiser converted to a carrier, Akagi, and her launching in, running in and launching a solo strike. Enough to upset the Americans, but not enough to, and draw them out, but not a massive risk to the Japanese in terms of force if they lose it. I wouldn't be surprised if that was it. And then you sort of work that out and go, well, that's not long going to work. They're not going to do that. They're not going to do that. Okay. Well, let's try and deliver a decisive blow. Let's turn the Americans into an unbalanced fleet in one blow. Because an unbalanced fleet is a weak fleet. If you can take out an enemy's carriers and capital ships in one go, they are going to be an unbalanced fleet and right for you to take out, won't they? Well, where are their carriers and their capital ships going to all be grouped together? In one easy place, at their weakest spot. Pearl Harbour. So let's go for that. And I think that change in plan is one of the reasons why Kaigan Taishio, that's Admiral Isaruku Yamamoto, who has since a combined fleet, ended up having to threaten to resign in order to get permission to put this plan together. Because I think changing the plan is basically the same as admitting that their long-term doctrine of attrition wasn't going to work. If you're basically admitting that the doctrine which you have built your entire fleet around, the Long Lance torpedo, all these things around this doctrine of attrition, is not going to work, that is a big thing. You see, just carrying out a plan of operations, that is not something you need to resign to push through, even in the Japanese system. But carrying out a plan which is going to completely change the basis of warfighting, that's a risk. That is a risk. But it makes sense. And also, this is the point when we're talking about Japanese culture and Japanese naval culture, etc. To change an operation is not that difficult. To change an operational concept, that is something else. That is a thing which requires a lot more effort. And I think that change comes about probably 1934 to 1938 period. I would strongly suspect it is a big feature behind the planning and construction of the Shikakus. I'm not sure about Soryu and Hiryu. Soryu and Hiryu still look to me like they are patterned after fleet operations for the attrition warfare. But when we start to look at the carriers being built, by the time of the Shikakus, they start to look to me like they are coming in for this strike. And the fact is, the Japanese wait for the Shikakus to be available to launch this strike. People talk about they're waiting for a certain amount of fuel and a certain amount of time build up and all these things. They are, yes. They have all these things as factors, but another factor, a very big factor in their war planning, are the Shikaku class and them being ready. Prince Otaga, I'm sorry, but there are 2 waves involved in Taranto. It's 2 waves. And the British war plan operational, the multi-carrier, if they'd gone through with the multi-carrier plan the British had for Taranto, if Eagle hadn't been damaged, or if they moved Ark Royal involved, it would have probably been a three-wave strike at night, and it would have used dive bombers. But the thing is, as often happens in war, it's dictated by what you have available. One of the reasons why the Japanese can get a full carrier fleet available for this is because it is how do I put this, peacetime when they're launching it. So they are launching this strike out of the blue when they are dictating the pace of operations. XMR, no one doubts. In the nicest way, the Japanese didn't even really think they had much of a chance. One of the interesting things, you have fights in Japan between the party who believes they shouldn't go to war because they'll lose, and the party who believes they should go to war because they'll lose. And the party who believes they should go to war because they'll lose is because they think they'll lose even if they go. They're already lost. Their only chance of small sliver of success is if they manage to fight a short war and win big enough they get a negotiated peace. And pretty much everyone who's visited either the British Empire or America knows that neither of those powers do frigating negotiated peaces. They don't. Don't worry, XMR and all. Yeah. The thing about if the carriers have been important, this is the point we get to with Genda, okay? Because often he's the one who brings up the ideas of the third strike, etc. And I will say this, that does fit with Japanese doctrine, and we'll talk about this more as we go on. But the reality is, you're looking at a force which probably was preparing to launch. If the American carriers had been in harbour, they would have definitely launched the third strike. But the thing is, the third strike is always going to be composed of aircraft which had come back from the first strike, and spare aircraft. It's always going to be composed of those 2 things. And on top of that, it's always going to be a case of as long as we know where the carriers are. Because if you don't know where the carriers are, or if you don't know where the capital ships are, you have problems. And I don't know why Twitch just flicked then. I don't know. It does it occasionally. Until I can get the new internet thing in, this is what I have to deal with. Mark Vren, USA thought they were going to lose the War of 1812. The smart, reasonable peace party, the Federalists, never recovered. No, they didn't. Now, this is where the Japanese concept starts to come in. And I do enjoy the Japanese concept. The Japanese concept of operation is about stealth. It's about quietness. It's about a sneaking attack. Now, officially, as said, this has begun in 1941. I don't think so. I'm going to tell you when it's said to officially begin, and you can read in sources, it's officially begun, and I will sit there and go, no, this does not. Naval forces, even the IJN, which sometimes is confusingly Byzantine in the umpteenth degree, do not do that. They start planning a long time in advance. They start preparing a long time in advance. They do not suddenly do these things for giggles. Ships and giggles. They just don't. And the reality is, the plan was quite simple. As I said, I think it comes from a raiding plan. They've worked out the charts, they've worked out the routes of how to avoid merchant ships, of how to avoid the spots where they might be spotted, of how to avoid all the threats which might see them coming in. And they're going to attack from the north, and they're going to launch a strike using the maximum number of aircraft they can, and they're going to take out the airfields, and they're going to attack the fleet. And that is it. They're going to take out the defences of Pearl Harbour, and they're going to take out the offensive of Pearl Harbour by taking out their fighting corps. Now, why would you do that? Why are carriers and capital ships that important? Why are capital ships that important? Let's be honest, we all know the history after World War II. Battleships disappear quickly. They're not that important. They're still very useful at this point. And let's be honest, the most scary thing for the Japanese in the entire run-up to this operation is if they're in a storm and they suddenly find themselves face-to-face with a pair of North Carolinas. Just think of this. And anyone in the chat is welcome to comment and disagree if they wish, but think about it. They find themselves in a storm running up against a couple of North Carolinas, North Carolina, Washington, a couple of new cruisers, and some destroyers in that storm when they couldn't launch aircraft. What happens to the Japanese force? Is there anything in that force which wants to fight that battle? No. There's nothing there. In the nicest way, those at the North Carolinas wipe them out. Without even a flinching. They don't care. They do it. And do it hard. And that's the reality we're talking about. So for the Japanese, they want to avoid not just enemy merchant ships, they not just want to avoid aircraft, they want to avoid submarines, they want to avoid everything. Now the thing is, for American submarines, again, this is the scenario you're dealing with at the time, there aren't that many in the Pacific at this point. There really aren't. There are a lot training up, there are a lot of capability, but there aren't that many available. Because the Americans are working up. This is the other thing which is driving the Japanese. That plan of attrition, that plan of that only works as long as the British and the Americans aren't built up. It's one of the really weird things. The Americans, through their Washington Naval Treaty, pushed the Japanese to the point at which they start aggressively thinking about war with America. They go from being, to be honest, an interesting version of a friendship, a slightly aggro friendship, but broadly speaking, they're in the same friend group. Remember, they're part of the Qualitative Race. They're intellectual property sharing with each other. This is the joyous of the thing of the Qualitative Dreadnought race. The fact is, the four powers involved really leading it are all sharing each other, their notebooks with each other all the whole time. The Italians, the British, the Americans, and the Japanese. And the thing is, the same treaty, the Washington Naval Treaty, which pushes the Japanese to the point at which they now feel afraid, rather than, we know we'll lose, but it costs you enough, you're going to worry about it, so we'll feel confident because of that, to, we'll just lose. Well, it also limits the American strength. And the thing is, the Japanese know the moment the Two-Ocean Naval Act and all these things are passed, they're annihilated. There is no chance attrition wins. There is no chance of them managing to compete with that. They can't. They just can't. Now, there are some interesting questions, and, well, yeah. Michael Cooch and Walter Brodus and Mark Hunters all put us in the chat, so I'll talk about it a bit. If they run into those surface ships, if they do run into them, then they're in a problem. Because they are close enough to Pearl Harbour, everyone knows why they're there, without announcing it. There's 6 carriers in that group. 2 battle cruisers, modernized Congos, 2 Tony-class cruisers, a full squadron of destroyers, which is about 3 divisions worth, including the ones which go off to the Midway Attack Force. They have a problem. Theoretically, they're ordered to go home if they're found, but the thing is, if they go home, it doesn't matter if they go home or not. If they go home, or that's basically stopped that attack. Because the moment the Americans find out the Japanese are getting that close to Pearl Harbor, you're never going to be able to do it again. So the other scenario is you go to high speed, you launch the strike as quickly as you can immediately then, and then you try and duck away. And remember, there are earlier parts of this plan which involve the fleet of them, all the carriers launching all their aircraft, them taking as many carriers as they can, taking 10 carriers with them. I think there's 8 carriers, but it might have been 10. 10 carriers, I think it was, with them, launching every single aircraft they could, and then withdrawing, and the pilots flying out to be covered by submarines. So the Japanese have prepared for a lot of suicide runs in this scenario. They are prepared for a lot of losses to achieve this goal. But yeah, there's the scenario where they don't fight, they don't do anything, but it ruins all their plans. It is a problem. It is a scenario which they would have to deal with. What do you do in that scenario? It's very easy to talk about it as a hypothetical, as a theory, but if you're Chusei no Nagumo in that situation, and you've been discovered by the 2 North Carolinas, what do you do? Sean Martin, the problem you have with that is, yes, if the Luftwaffe had the Zero, the main issue with it would have been confronting quite a lot of Spitfires. And whilst it's a very good long-range and fast aircraft, it's not really the world's best bomber escort. It doesn't fit with the German tactical doctrine, and you're probably going to find it's actually perfect thing to be shredded by the 303 machine gun. In fact, it's one of the few things which can be shredded by a 303 machine gun. Combine that with radar and the sheer number of fighters the British have in the air, and that's the poor Zero is going to be suffering. Because it's not going to be, as was shown when the whole thing of the FAC weave against the Zero was, well, if you were doing interweaving with your aircraft and they tried to get in, you could take them out quite easily as long as you could hit them. And they couldn't line up. Well, the thing is, that works because the Americans have a number of aircraft to do that. In the scenario where you're talking about, the Germans are always attacking into a far stronger amount of British fighters, of Royal Air Force fighters, in terms of the fighter strength. The British always have far more available because they are not flying from a long way away. So yeah, it doesn't help them. Prince of Tonga, please go. Nicest way, Nagumo was a destroyer man. Saying he's not naturally aggressive is being absurd. So please don't bring that one here. He was one of the most aggressive destroyer commanders the Japanese produced. There is a very much a misunderstanding about Nagumo, and that's why I did a whole video about him. You know, people go, he's not aggressive, he's not a carrier man. No, the most aggressive officers in the navies in this time period were all destroyermen. Why? Because they would take their very small ships as close as they could to an enemy to drop torpedoes in them and make holes which would sink them. And that they were chosen literally for aggression. So when you have a guy who's that senior, a destroyer officer, trust me, he's got enough aggression. Now, then we get into the force structure for the plan. It's always an interesting time to get into force structure. They're taking the 1st, 2nd, and 5th Carrier Divisions. Akagi and Kaga, Soryu and Hiryu, Shikaku and Zukaku. They leave behind Ziho, Hosho, Ryuju, and Taiyo. Hyo and Junyo aren't yet ready for war. They're not ready for war. They are not ready for war. And that's... the thing is, they're not even commissioned until 1942. But theoretically, the Japanese could have taken more carriers for them. And I honestly think if they had been doing that kind of suicide run, they had been doing that scenario, I think you would have seen 3rd and 4th Carrier Division taken with them. Because they are there and they are extra aircraft. They might not be a lot extra aircraft, but they are extra aircraft. It's an interesting thing to think about is what happens if those 4 Carrier Divisions are with them, but they would slow them down. And that's the trouble. Though, Kaga really doesn't exactly allow them to accelerate. The fact is, if they were selecting purely on speed, then Kaga shouldn't have made the cut. But they are selecting on what provides enough strike potential and strike capability, and we can get in and get out. Has the range and the capability to support the operations. But they are not taking their whole force. This is another reason why I point out that the Pearl Harbour is not a Kantai-Kessen operation. Because if it was a Kantai-Kessen, they'd have taken all their carriers at the very least. Because a key part of Kantai-Kessen is you're using a decisive component of your own force, or perhaps the full force of your own force, full force you have available to smash a decisive component of your decisive component of your opponent's forces. That's it. Now, on a scale of aggression for Nagumo, Angry Wolverine to Royal Navy Tribal CO, probably closer to the Wolverine than the Royal Navy Tribal CO, but that's mainly because you have Philip Vian and the Wolf in the Royal Navy Tribal CO groups. You have people who are sufficiently aggressive to make Genghis Khan feel that he's feel a bit troubled by it. Going, what the friggin' are you? On top of that, they have the two Tony class cruisers to provide them with reconnaissance, because reconnaissance is a critical part of the force structure. If they want to try and navigate their way through the world without being spotted, they need to spot others first. They need to make sure their path is clear. They need to make sure no one sees their fleet. And they have to worry about that. Yes, the number of merchant ships with radios is very few. It is very, very few. But they do exist. And yes, they've orientated themselves as far away as they can from the main trading routes, from the routes which are going to have the bigger, more modern merchant vessels on them. But yeah. And the reason you're not throwing everything at Pearl Harbor. Well, the Brus is right, but there's also... That's the point. They're not throwing everything, which is why it's not a Kantai-Kessen. But if they had decided it was going to decisive battle, then frankly, as it's technically launched in peace, it's technically launched at the beginning of the war, okay, so they're technically at peace everywhere else, you could have structured your forces there. You could have tried to take all 10. I wouldn't necessarily advise it, but it's one of the options they have. It doesn't necessarily help them, and you're going to require an even bigger escort. So probably at that point, if you're putting so many eggs in one basket, you're probably having to take all 4 Congos with you, and probably 4 heavy cruisers, and probably a couple of squadrons of destroyers, and suddenly you've got a force which is many times larger than the previous force you were sending, and you have probably stretched your logistics and infrastructure past the point of breaking. So that's the other limitation on the Japanese. This is another reason why I think why when I talk about this and talk about the concept of the attack versus the actual attack on Pearl Harbor, when I'm talking about the differences, I usually am focusing on things that... How do I put this? The logistics they've built up suggests to me the possibility of a raiding function on a raid with single carrier. If they've been planning longer term, i.e. earlier than roughly 1934 to 38 period to make the change, if they've been planning longer term to have a larger strike, then I think you have more of investment in logistics assets. Because, yeah. Kalaga, why did the US Navy not have a radar station to defend Hawaii in the same way the US Army did? Would it have mattered? Callan, I'm going to be very cruel, but I'm going to explain it. Basically, we're doing a shameless book plug in the middle, and then after that, we're looking at the US Navy and its history of attacking Pearl Harbor, because one of the key things with it was their exercises, etc., how they were planning to attack Pearl Harbor, and that explains some of the reasons why they missed, but also it provides a further argument for why they shouldn't have missed the signs the Japanese were coming to attack them. And one of the things we'll be talking about is the defense of Hawaii. So can I park that question until we get to those slides? So just someone make a note of that question, please, if one of the admins can, and make sure to remind me of it when we get to those slides, okay? With that all being said, let's consider the plan. So here you have the arch, you have the drive for secrecy, so no one knows you're coming, you have all the sneaky beaky, you have everything. But here's the thing, and here's the other issue you have with the Japanese. They were involved in British strikes and planning, they were involved as an ally in learning about it in terms of British strikes in World War I. They have been developing their own aerial torpedoes. They are focused on oceanic combat, though. How can you tell that? Because whilst they do have wooden fins to extend and give them a slightly better support, they haven't gone the whole hog to make them shallow dive specialists. You must remember, if a torpedo goes in at this angle, it will most likely keep going down for quite a while because of momentum before it rights itself and starts travelling up. And to the level it's supposed to be travelling at and fighting at. Which means it can hit the ocean bed. It can impact the floor of the harbour. And then it usually goes boom or gets stuck in the mud. And you've lost your torpedo. So if you're really planning this operation in depth for a long time as an actual strike, you'd expect to do a lot more development work on torpedoes, on aviation torpedoes, and get to something like the British developed, which was the system to make their torpedoes belly flop. They still had the fins added on the back, but they also had a tension cable, and they're the only ones who do this. And that means their torpedoes, if they drop from right height, belly flop slightly. If they drop slightly too high, they go in like this, but that's still not going to be that bad. And actually, interesting enough, if they drop from too lower height, and this causes trouble in some operations, they actually go in like this, tail first. And that can cause a problem as well. And this is why often when people turn around to me and tell me the Swordfish is so out of date, I go, which was the only torpedo bomber in World War II in 1939 to 1941, which could make its torpedoes belly flop and run shallow every single time? It's the Swordfish. None of the other aircraft could do it, because no one else had developed that system. Because the Royal Navy were absolutely obsessed with fighting a fleet in harbour, i.e. exercising their demons from World War I, where the Germans had hidden in harbour away from them, and destroying things. Whereas everyone else wanted to attack a fleet in harbour. That was part of their concept of operations, something they were doing, but they're more concerned with oceanic battles. The British were concerned with oceanic battles, but the thing is, they also have this deep-seated anger, this trauma from World War I of them. They just hid in harbour, so we have to learn how to kill them in harbour, because they just hid in harbour. It's a fun time. It's a fun bit of history. But honestly, you also have the attack working through the waves, and that's a strike scenario. And as I've said before, it's a thing of Nagumo's right when he doesn't order the third strike. He is right, because you don't know where the carriers are. You don't know where the American carriers are. So you don't launch your third strike, because what happens if they're there about to pounce on you? You need to be able to respond to them. You need to be able to engage them. You need to be able to fight them back, and that's going to be the aircraft you have. But if they had launched the third wave, if the carriers had been in Pearl Harbour along with the capital ships, well, honestly, that probably goes in by that point as those ships are probably with anti-cruiser and anti-infrastructure weaponry. Why? Because most of their vital torpedoes and other things had actually been used up in the first two waves. So that kind of defines their target list for the third strike. And by the way, Japanese concept operations was to do a shoot look scenario, kind of like we do with modern missile strikes and modern air defense missiles. Jacob, are there any harbours designed and layout to discourage torpedo bombers? Not particularly, because usually what shapes a harbour is geography. Before you can pick anything else, it's geography. But you do stick up a load of anti-torpedo nets and try and do things around that. The pink square around the torpedo? Oh, that just allows me to hold it. Basically, I used to have a load of these portable Wi-Fi systems. I don't know if you know what they look like in the UK. They were little squares. And they came with a lot of these, which were in various different colours. And a few years ago, I was hunting for something to hold this when I was doing this, and I just found one sitting left on the side and just went, that'll work. Besides, the great thing, this is the advantage of being the only boy and as many cousins as I am. They all universally dislike pink. It's brilliant. They're all girls, they all universally dislike pink. So if I want to make sure I keep any stuff, I may get the pink version of it. And it never gets nicked. It's brilliant. It's one of the reasons why my stapler, the one I have actually managed to hold on to for the longest, is a bright pink stapler. Because no one nicks the bright pink stapler. It works. The things we do. The things we do. Now, with that being said, shameless book plug time and patting poodle time. Thank you everyone for supporting the channel, for liking, sharing, subscribing. If there are any questions people have quickly about just the Japanese section, just quickly stick them in the chat and I'll try and get to them before we move on to the American side. But as said, after this we're going to look at the American fleet exercises and experience prior to World War II, which should have helped them analyse what the Japanese were doing, should have given them an idea of how to defend their Pearl Harbour, and we'll talk about that. But I would argue, for example, there's a discussion over defence of the harbour. The primary defence of Pearl Harbour is intelligence and distance. And if you're not getting past the intelligence information, then that kind of negates the distance as well. But yeah. We're going to look through Fleet Problems 13 and Fleet Problems 19, which are the ones which really do give us some experience. And by the way, there's some great articles out about them. Bowman, did the Japanese ever consider using skip bombing? I think they were trying to start on that path, but remember there's a lot of developments which go into making skip bombing work. There's a lot of developments which go into making skip bombing work. It's, a lot of things are, what size is your R&D? And this is the problem for the Japanese, the problem for every power is you only have so many R&D facilities, you only have so many scientists and engineers who can do research and development, so many teams who can do research and development, and therefore you can only research and develop so much. The British Empire, America, has a lot more teams than the Japanese, and so they can do a lot more research, but the Japanese are focusing on where they have to focus and not. John Shea, the amount of info and random facts about Doc's whole family you get every live and videos is both amazing and scary. Yeah. I mean, it's the whole reason we moved to where we moved is we're surrounded by more family. It's fun. Calvin Gaswick. Steep nomads, like Genghis Khan's horde, excelled in feigned retreats, a concept which looks incompatible with the tribal mentality. Yes, and they did, and it's a core part of Japanese culture as well, the feigned retreat. This is why the attrition idea does fit with their scenario, and why abandoning it is quite such a big thing. When I looked through, and I was looking at the reasoning behind Yamamoto especially having to threaten to resign, it didn't make sense. If it was purely over a simple plan, that shouldn't have been enough to push him that far. And I realise that the IJN is a very toxic atmosphere at this point. I realise it's driven by various factions, but if you consider the realities of what they're planning at the time, he's planning an offensive attack that should fit with all the factions' desires for Pearl Harbour. That shouldn't require a threat to resign to push it through. The only reason it would is if that attack is basically them omitting one of their core doctrines is not going to work, is not viable. And omitting that is a far bigger, far scarier thing. My coach, if the FDR hadn't sent the US fleet to Pearl Harbor and kept it on San Diego, would the IJN plan have stayed as a raid, or would they have tried raiding San Diego? Honestly, they wouldn't have any choice, but, raiding San Diego is about all they can do, because they cannot do a 6-carrier operation as far as San Diego. They could possibly sustain a 2-carrier attack on San Diego. But again, getting it there without being discovered would be a lot more difficult. It's one of the reasons why I usually argue Force Z and the British should have centered a fleet should have centered their force in the Far East around Ceylon. Or Trichinopoly in Ceylon, i.e. modern-day Sri Lanka. Because if they had, they're so much further inside the Indian Ocean that the Japanese can never hope to attack them. So they can always tell the Japanese are coming and they can respond. Whereas the Japanese won't know they're coming till they break into the South China Sea and where they're coming from. So that's sort of the scenario. If the Americans' main base is still back in San Diego, and the thing is their main base still was back in San Diego. That's the problem. The infrastructure is all back in San Diego. This is the problem for Richardson, who does get the intelligence reports before Kimmel and is arguing constantly with the government. And Kimmel is that all their infrastructure is back in San Diego. And they put them in Pearl Harbor without investing in it. So they've exposed them. They've made them more of a viable threat. But honestly, there is the firm belief in America, and this is one of the things which is hardest to stomach, I suppose, especially for people in the post 9/11 generation of security professionals and academics. There was a real concept in America this time. They believed they wouldn't be attacked, that no one would touch them. No one would dare attack American soil because the response would be so swift, so devastating, so terrible. No one would do it. Aaron Walker, to stop my paper plates from being pinched, I use kitty animal plates. Nobody still on any of those. Very sensible. But what would have happened had Yamamoto survived the war? Would he have been put on trial? I think that would be an interesting scenario. Let me put it this way. Considering the Bomber Harris precedents, I doubt it. Unless he could be linked to specific actions which were war crimes, I doubt he would have been convicted on anything or put on a trial. There are things which he was involved, but it wouldn't be for Pearl Harbour he would be put on trial for. Because as far as he knew when he was giving the orders, and the same for Nagumo, the diplomats had done what they were supposed to do. The diplomats were running late. Issues were issues. So whilst I don't think they would have been put on trial for Pearl Harbour, there are other things which they could have been done, but again, I have a feeling they wouldn't have survived. I have a feeling they'd have been met by someone and would have had a probably committed seppuku, and made sure they didn't. I think that's right. Is that the right one? Made sure they didn't stand trial. I don't think they would have been captured. Now, I hope no one minds, but before we start the next thing, I am getting another. I'm gonna quickly A, grab my water bottle, and B, get another iron brew. And that's gonna mean I'm gonna have had 5 cans of iron brew today. I'm having way too many. It's too hot. Oh, I'm already down to the second case. This is bad. This has been so hot. That's trouble. Keep talking and being hot is not good. I got iron brew. I am actually doing stuff here. I am explaining naval history to people. What are you doing to deserve what you are currently demanding? Just looking cute. Okay. Seppuku. Moral support. Believe it or not, he does have water over there. He does have a bowl of food. He does have everything over there. He has his own little station. And I did promise him, hopefully, and this is good news before we get further on, he's not going to have, touch wood, have to have the ear operation. It appears to have cleared up. It appears to have touched wood. So he's not going to have, because he was going to have brain surgery. And he was going to have his whole right ear internally removed because it was infected. And we basically did a last ditch roll of the dice with some very heavy steroids. So he went all and some very heavy antibiotics, which made him go and he now appears to be okay, don't you, Big Fluff? And not going to need the surgery, which is good. But he is slightly upset with me because I promised him if he had to have surgery, I was buying a sofa for him here for him to lie on. He now has realised that because he's not having surgery, therefore I don't need to honour that promise because it was if he had surgery. However, that's the face I'm getting every time I mention he's not getting a couch. That is the face I'm getting. He is very annoyed with me. He wants the couch. I will have to get something at some point, but it won't be as soon, okay? There are other priorities. There are other priorities. No. Oh, so let's consider how would the USN have attacked Pearl Harbour. Well, for this, I actually have an advantage. I have a really cool advantage to talk to you about because there was an article published in 2011 on the USNI blog, and I love this article. I keep it signposted, okay? And it's the fleet problems of the 30s, but as written up by a dive bomber pilot. And Fleet Problem 13 is described as this. 1932 was an interesting year following the invasion of China by Japan. The scenario proposed that Hawaii had been taken over by an enemy, and the US Navy was dispatched to take it back. In a joint exercise, the Army played the part of the black occupying power and our Navy the blue attacking force. Captain John Towers, Chief of Staff, planned to use the carriers Lexington and Saratoga to launch a sneak attack on the Army in Hawaii prior to covering landings by the Marines. On Saturday, February the 5th, the two carriers and destroyers formed a separate task force and left the main battle fleet, making high-speed runs into a launch position 100 miles north of Oahu. During the night, at dawn Sunday morning, a surprised army woke to the roar of the fleets of aircraft attacking their installations. Captain Towers had timed the attack perfectly. Captain Towers' own remark on this was the fact that Japan nearly duplicated this attack on Pearl on Sunday morning, 7th December 1941, was no accident. Early in the 1950s, Towers dined in Tokyo with a Japanese vice admiral who had participated in the planning. He told me they'd simply taken a page out of our own book. I doubt it was quite so simple. I sincerely doubt it was quite so simple. But the point is, in 1932, the US Navy had carried out its own Pearl Harbour. Yes, it had used only a couple of aircraft carriers. It had not had that many available. But it had carried out its first Pearl Harbour. And that should have been the lesson. You know, this is a fleet-worthy target. This is a fleet-worthy target. And after that, the US Navy's capital ships came into line and shelled and attacked the space, and then the US Marines landed. One of the points of history is you get a lot of convergent development. You get a lot of convergent development. And you have a lot of professionals, and this is professional naval officers, sitting, studying situations, and trying to come up with solutions to similar problems. There's going to be a similar response. And the fact is, the US Navy has got such a pattern. The US Navy, the US Army, the forces of the US in Hawaii have got into such a habit of easygoing Sunday mornings that not only have the enemy noticed, have the Japanese noticed, and have the British noticed, because there are British remarks when the British ships pay port visits to Pearl Harbour and Hawaii. The British notice this thing on Sunday mornings, and I'm not quite sure why it gets so lax every Sunday morning. It really does seem to get lax every Sunday morning. And this is, if Kimmel and the other officers are responsible for anything, it's the fact that is still going on in 1941. They get lax every Sunday morning. Yes, they're at peace. Yes, it's peacetime. But in the middle of a fleet problem, you're supposed to be acting like it's wartime. Why are you still having the lackadaisical Sunday morning? It's such a thing, it's noticed and it's being acknowledged even by their own Navy. So the US Navy has isolated as a weakness to attack the Army in Fleet Problem 13, and yet no one has done anything about it. 9 years. 9 years before Pearl Harbour. 9 years before Pearl Harbour. This is the problem when we start trying to argue against conspiracy theorists, is the Americans shoot themselves in the foot so many times. And the trouble is, here is the problem for the conspiracy theorists when it comes to Pearl Harbour. The Americans have a combination of arrogance, belief that they are, how do I put this, the star in their own movie, and this is, everyone has this view, and I would say also a belief in American exceptionalism to an extent. That means they don't really see other people doing this to them. And the thing is, it's not just the US Army, okay? The US Navy is like that in Pearl Harbour on a Sunday morning. So both the Army and the Navy are the same when they're in Pearl Harbour on a Sunday morning. They are like this. Both forces are like this. The Navy knows it's such a weakness, they use it in the frigating exercise to annihilate the Army. They use it. And they still do it themselves. I could guarantee you, the next Sunday after this exercise was over, if you launch a strike on Pearl Harbour with the US Navy fleet sitting in there after the exercise and the US Army, you would have had the exact same scenario take place as if you launched it in 7 December 1941. I guarantee you. Because there is a level of just plain, I don't know, head in the sand? It's not, Floyd, it's not even inter-service rivalry at this point. They're both as bad as each other. Thank you very silent Mars. So, yes, there was a question earlier about why did the US Navy not have radar? Well, because the US Army was supposed to provide it. But the fact is, the US Navy do have their own airfields. The US to support their own aircraft. The Army have their fields and all this stuff on Pearl Harbour. They have, in Oahu. They have all this stuff in Hawaii. Frankly, the thing is, they do it to themselves, and yet they're still not prepared. They're still not prepared. Because, to an extent, you're right. Admiral Pai, Mark Harkness, Admiral Pai and many others did believe the Japanese wouldn't dare. Admiral Turner willfully ignores and doesn't pass on information to Admiral Kimmel, to the people in charge at Pearl Harbour, because despite him thinking there's a 50-50 chance they might attack Pearl Harbour, he fundamentally believes they'd never attack American soil, so it must be the Philippines. No worry, Mouse. Oh, no worry, sorry, Mouse. It's very kind of you to buy it. I'm happy. I'm happy whatever people buy it on if they enjoy it. It's criminal. It could arguably be criminal negligence, but here's the thing. Here's the really interesting thing. Yarnold goes and gives this report about this to the politicians in Congress, to the White House, and they don't do anything either. It's criminal negligence of the whole government. This is one of the reasons why Kimmel and the army commander are made such big examples of, I swear, because it's to distract from the fact that, oh frigate, and nicest way, everyone for the last 20 years is probably responsible for the situation. Very silent mouse. Are you suggesting the Japanese have the mental acuity of the same as the British and the Americans to be able to attack more than one place at once? That's heresy in Turner's world. That's heresy. And remember, Turner had made it so that now operations ran intelligence. Rather than intelligence and operations being separate, Turner had managed to, using his connections in the White House, get control of intelligence by the time of 1941, and that was a problem which was soon solved afterwards, because it turned out operations people are not the people you want running intelligence. Because intelligence are about asking questions. Operations are about looking for answers. And there is a difference with that. Because if you're looking for an answer, you're looking for information which fits your which already fits. If you're asking questions, you're not looking for answers, you're looking for what the information is. So then comes to Admiral King, okay? Admiral Ernest King. One of my favourite officers, and probably one of the most important officers in the US Navy's history in the 20th century. And he is so fed up with the way that everyone has been ignoring the lesson of the 13th fleet problem. That in 1938, when he's Vice Admiral Commander Aircraft of the Battle Force, he takes 3 carriers and he attacks at 4:30 on a Tuesday morning and wipes everyone out to make the point. It's not even a Sunday. It's a Tuesday morning. And he still wrecks them. With 3 carriers. And that's the problem here. He does it again. And you sit there and go, okay, so, all right. This is 6 years later, right? This is Fleet Problem 13, and this is Fleet Problem 19. So 6 years have passed on, and you've just been shown you haven't learned the lessons of the one 6 years ago. He's done the exact same thing to you. You're going to prep now. You're going to prepare, aren't you? You're going to change. You're going to improve yourselves. Yeah, they don't. They don't. King says, you know, his famous comment when he's called to run the Navy in the beginning of World War II. When the American involvement in World War II is called up, they've called in the sons of bitches. That's because, in nicest way, they've been avoiding having the sons of bitches, to use the phraseology, in charge, because they've been causing too much trouble by embarrassing them. There is a good argument. The reason why these fleet problems do not lead to massive changes is because if they lead to massive changes, people are going to start asking questions about why they're in that space in the first place, how they got there. And that could lead to a whole lot of difficult discussions for the US Congress, for the occupants of the White House. And so they don't do it. So the point I'm trying to make to people is that Pearl Harbour is not a conspiracy theory. It's worse. It's stupidity. It is, we have done this to ourselves twice, and we fundamentally are not going to acknowledge the fact that someone else could do it to us. I mean, the scenario is, I will stab myself to see if I bleed, if I can have my skin punctured by stabbing myself. I can, okay, but I do not believe anyone else could stab me and puncture my skin. That is the equivalent of this. Walter Burroughs, no, the intelligence information isn't pointing to the Philippines. That's the point. If you look up Admiral Turner's testimony, he was the one coordinating the intelligence coming in. He admits it was 50-50, Philippines or Pearl Harbor. 50-50. And he decided not to inform Pearl Harbor of this at all, nor did he allow them to have access to the unredacted raw information, which they had previously got under Admiral Richardson. So Kimmel doesn't get the same level of information access for his staff as Richardson had had, and he doesn't get the warning from Turner. So it is worse. Yeah, I'm having a valid crash out because this is one of the things, I read this stuff and I'm looking at this stuff and I'm sitting there going, there are literally generations of people who are responsible for everyone who died at Pearl Harbor, and there are excuses for them prior to 1932. Okay? There is an excuse they could possibly make. They didn't realize it was coming. Even after, all the things which happened in World War I, and the fact that the US were just as filled in by the British on their plans during World War I as the Japanese were. Just as filled in on the plans as what the British were building up to. And, then the fact that the Americans have their own doctrine for attacking fleets in harbour. They have excuses up till 1932. They have no excuses after 1932. And after 1938, it's frigating horrendous. So what would an American plan have looked like? Well, honestly, an American war plan probably looks like some of their carrier raids on Japan. A multi-carrier operation, probably not involving 6 carriers, probably involving 2 or 3. And launching a strike. In fact, we know exactly what an American plan would look like. It would have been turn up early morning when no one's awake, hit the harbour, hit the targets, and walk away. Why do we know what the American plan would look like? Because they did it. Twice. In Technicolor. Walter Brothers, you are not arguing with all 92. You are at this point disagreeing with me, and I am literally telling you, if you want to, go look up Admiral Turner's testimony to Congress. Okay? In his testimony to Congress, the officer who was in charge of operations and who had got oversight of intelligence, because that has been how the White House had pushed to decide to be an actually admits that in his mind, he was 50-50 because of the information he was receiving. And yet he chose not to inform the authorities at Pearl Harbor. So, he's sending out warnings to the Western Pacific. He is sending out the warnings to the Western Pacific. But that's because he's choosing to send out the warnings to the Western Pacific. Not because that's the only place the intelligence is pointing to. It's having he's presumed the Japanese would not dare. His assumption of operations is the Japanese would not dare attack Pearl Harbor. So he doesn't believe, even though he's 50-50 not sure, he doesn't bother, he doesn't inform them. Because he does. So that's on him. It's not the intelligence. The Americans are receiving the intelligence. They're receiving the information. It's literally his ego. Thank you for the stretch and the hydrate, Paul. Thank you. Oh. But Walter Bros, if you want to be really depressed, go and look up Admiral Turner's testimony. It truly is How that man avoided being indicted is probably down to his subsequent war service, but realistically, he was just, yeah. This is why I have the rating of Admiral Turner I do. Some people sometimes tell me I'm a bit harsh on him. Yeah. Ghost Jones, which PR? The hearings of 25,000. Go look at Admiral Turner's testimony. His own testimony. He actually admits it. He admits in his own words, it was 50-50, but I decided Pearl Harbour, they would never attack Pearl Harbour, so I didn't inform them. Admits it. Admiral Turner was very heavily connected to the White House. Basically, the midget submarines were added to the attack because, in nice well, why not? Why not attack them as well? And you might get some more kills. And remember what I talked about, the aerial torpedoes? The Japanese knew their aerial torpedoes could go into the bomb. But the submarine-launched torpedoes wouldn't, would they? They wouldn't belly flop. But they would be covered for, their presence would be covered for by the air attack. So having them go in and launch makes sense. It gives the midget submarines cover for their operations, but also gives you guaranteed torpedoes. And remember, the two ways you sink a ship. Start a fire that can't be put out. Or make a hole which lets in water. You're going to pour me, I'm going to torpedo you. Come here, you cute boy. You're a cute boy, aren't you? Yes, you are. So the American attack would have looked very similar to the Japanese attack, which means that the Americans should have known what they were looking for. They were looking for a large group of carriers, and honestly, you don't put together a large group of carriers for an attack on a small target. And they're naval fighters, naval aircraft, and whilst the Japanese do use them for attacking land targets, they do. If you're going to go after if you're putting this many carriers together, this many carriers are disappearing, this size of carriers, then honestly, your only two targets which are viable targets from they're chasing for are the fleet in Philippines or the fleet in Pearl Harbour. And that should mean, nice way, you don't take risks in that scenario. You don't know where they are. You can't find them. You don't have satellites. What you do is you immediately go to full alert. You tell those bases to go to full alert. You tell them to get in position and get ready. Anyway, this is the whole problem. I think, to my mind, with Pearl Harbour is it's just so many layers of people making decisions out of arrogance. All right then. Outside this, I've done better intel on the US having better intel on the Japanese movements. I did an alternative history video on that one, where they basically found the Japanese fleet at sea. And the plan today was I thought this video would have a lot of questions, so I basically worked this out so it'd be roughly a 2-hour video in terms of presentation time, and then would be about an hour of questions with me hopefully setting up the bot. Hopefully the bot will work. Don't worry, Alice. So the thing is, the planning for Pearl Harbour starts a lot earlier and is a concept of operations for a lot longer than it is a firm plan. I would say it evolves from the Japanese angle, and I would say it evolves from the American angle. As you have more carriers come in. One of the interesting things I found when I'm doing this research is the amount of effort people trying to put towards who was the first guy to conceive of multi-carrier operations. The thing is, that's kind of a hard one to go by, because the British are operating multiple carriers together before the others are, because they have more carriers. The British actually have the most carriers in the world of any naval power in terms of numbers of hulls up until 1939. Actually, till well after 1939, they actually have the world's first drone carrier, the Queen Bee program carrier HMS Argus. And there is for the Royal Navy, we probably would go with Henderson as the guy who really puts together multi-carrier operations, but there again, he is building on his position of Rear Admiral aircraft carriers. Is because the Royal Navy is running multi-carrier operations, they need a Rear Admiral aircraft carriers. So it's something already earlier. But there again, for the Japanese, they have Gendra. And he puts forward those things, and he's putting forward these ideas. And for the Americans, they have... Honestly, King is one of the ones who puts forward multi-carrier operations and really does push it, and a few others like that. And realistically, multi-carrier operations are a natural, convergent development of the realities of your targeting systems you have available in the 1920s and 30s, the firepower available of each individual aircraft, and the fact that more aircraft equals better. More aircraft does equal better. It's an interesting scenario. I think, and I will say this, I think it was always going to be a multi-carrier attack. And as I said, it's not a Kantai-Kessen, but it is certainly a battle which is designed to make your enemy off balance. I'd say, again, it's a kind of realization the attrition war doctrine is not going to work. The Japanese have held to the attrition doctrine. You have to remember, the attrition war doctrine had worked very well on the Russians. The distance and the whole geography of the situation had worked very well for the Japanese versus the Russians at Tsushima. That's a problem. That means it has become almost an article of faith. The trouble with such things becoming an article of faith is you become committed to, is you build your force around them. And whilst Pearl Harbour is ultimately, as I've said before, not enough of a hit to it's enough of a hit to make the Americans angry and actually potentially do come the charging out and do the whole scenario of that they wanted, that the Americans had planned to avoid with War Plan Orange, and had known to avoid, and which the Japanese wanted to make the attrition operation possible, but actually at the same time was successful enough that it actually made that impossible for the Americans to do. They have no battle fleet to charge out with because of the disorder caused by it. And it also fails to take out, well, whilst it imbalances the American fleet, the fact is the ships there are not the core of the fighting fleet. The standard battleships, etc., which are at Pearl Harbour, are the fighting battle line of the US Navy. They are. They are the solid battle line. They are built among the solid World War I 1920s principles of the mass battle fleet that works together, operates together, evolutes together at the same speed to provide mass fire, which is going to devastate and overwhelm your enemy. They are the anvil around which you will press the enemy and you will hammer them into. But they're not the hammer of the American force. And the thing is about an anvil is it tends to be okay, it's a big project to do, but it tends to be not that difficult to fix in terms of getting a new one, because an anvil is an anvil. The hammer If you ever realize this, the Forge Master's hammer, that's something far more special, far more specialized for the individual. And for the Americans, they have the North Carolinas, they have the other battleships, fast battleships coming out, they have the carriers coming along. They have the hammer still. There we go. Anyway, with that being said, as said, I'm going to activate the bot. Hopefully, he says. Hopefully. We activate the bot. We will see how long it takes for the bot to activate. Honestly, Bowman Boy, I'd say the Japanese start to abandon the attrition doctrine when they realize it's just not going to work against the Americans and the British. The force disparity is just too great. It's still starting up. It's not connected yet, Runon. It's still connecting. It's having fun with YouTube. Bot is active, but we'll see if it's, manages to wake up. It's having fun trying to connect to everyone. No. Let's see, I'll do some questions the old-fashioned way while we're waiting for the bot to work. But please don't swarm with questions at the moment while I'm waiting for the bot to work. What would be the options for adapting torpedoes for use in harbour as drop from high-speed monoplanes? Given retention wire probably wouldn't work. It's tension, not retention wire. I'm just going to clarify that because... Not because I think you've got it wrong, but because, in a nice way, maybe I didn't pronounce it properly earlier. Tension wire, so it's a tension wire. It actually breaks off. Honestly, because the tension wire breaks from the aircraft, you can be coming in quite high to drop it from it, and honestly, it doesn't cause that much load. It breaks off at both ends at the end. But I would... The probable solution is going to be something to do with parachutes and how you can get those in. And thanks for the offer, Paul. But let's try and see if the bot will work. I'm now restarting Steambot again. It's trying to connect. It seems to be StreamerBot which has the trouble, not the coding, not anything else, the actual bot, the actual program. I think, Paul, I'm going to have to take you up on your offer. I think I am. Thanks, Paul. So, Paul is going to take questions from YouTube and Twitch and make sure the questions end up in the Discord so I don't miss any questions. And so I'm going to do this button, which means questions are open. And I'm going to do questions for roughly an hour or so. Okay. And the questions, if anyone's looking for them, will turn up in the Brewships Q&A channel. So we had a question from Kalinega. Why did the US Navy not have a radar station to defend Hawaii in the same way the US Army did? Would it have mattered? The only thing that would have possibly been different if the US Navy had established it, their ratio of operations is slightly different. So the US Army was establishing what was essentially a mobile radar station rather than a permanent one. The US Navy would have built a permanent one, which would have meant they would probably not have had to shut it down due to lack of fuel. But it's still been an interesting scenario whether it had been running properly. John Shea, when looking through history, I rarely get depressed. Every time I hear about the ego, pride, and the arrogance, my soul fills with disgust and rage. Yeah. Welcome to the reason why I drink so much Iron Brew. No, and have a fluffy poodle next to me. Let me put it this way. Sometimes these things are hard on others because it's why I have this theory that a lot of conspiracy theories are human beings trying to make sense of what is just unfathomable to most minds. And you have to realize that these are people who are forced to make compromises. They are compromising, and eventually they compromise their souls too far. That's what happens to politicians. That's what happens to all these things at a certain point. I always think the thing is you need to learn when you to pull out of things like politics. It's like my view on history and teaching. The moment I stop wanting to learn new things and stop being open to learning new things, the moment I stop listening to other people, I might disagree with them fundamentally. I might think their arguments are absolutely logical and don't make any sense at all. And so I don't have to agree with them. But the moment I stop listening to them, the moment I stop wanting to learn other things, is the moment I should stop teaching. And I'm very lucky that doesn't seem to be affecting me. But I know others who have passed that way and decide to still teach, and I honestly think their teaching suffers for it. I think it's the same with politicians and compromises. They make compromises to make things work. And at a certain point, they compromise too far. Okay, downright twaddle, off topic. Have you been able to catch any of Dr. Ballard's expedition to Iron Bottom Sound, and how much sleep do you think John Marshall isn't getting? I would presume he's getting absolutely zero sleep. He's one of those people who, I know a lot of people who know, and we sort of move in the same circles. I wouldn't call him a friend, because I think I have met him in person, but I think it was at one conference a long time ago. So it's sort of a case of no. And John is a very active, very hard worker, and is probably right now is glued to a lot of computer screens, trying to learn things as completely as possible. Chaser McLeod, would the Keto Batai have been able to actually sink the battle line if it had sortied? A lot seem to claim this would be the outcome if Pearl Harbour had been warned. You see, the thing is, if the battle line had manoeuvred, and I've discussed this before, it depends where they are, where are they sitting, whether the Keto Batai find them, whether they formed up with the carriers, and also the fact is they're manoeuvring at that point, which makes them far more difficult targets. They're able to fire their guns more freely because they're not going to be worried about hitting land positions and hitting bases. They're going to be fully locked down. So they're going to be in full sailing order, which is very different than being open for admiral's inspections on a Sunday morning. All these things mean that whilst in theory, yes, the Keto Batai could sink them, the reality is they probably actually sink less if they do find them, and they probably don't find them. They probably don't find them. That's the reality of it. The thing is, if you want to make it so they don't find them, it's very easy. The realistic thing is, the Americans, if the battle fleet goes out, it probably goes either southeast or southwest. because those are the safe spaces for it to go and position itself, and then use the aircraft from Pearl Harbour to try and find the enemy. And that means that they are the other side of Pearl Harbour. They are that much further away. Then the odds of the Japanese finding them are very, very low. I think I've got that. Got that one. Wilson triplets. How would World War II go if Japan was in the Allies and the USSR was in the Axis? Well, I've done this scenario in a video which was Zeros over the Mediterranean, which looked at just that, the Japanese joining the Allies, and what would happen. It's very, very bad for the Italians. It's really not good for the Germans. It's not a good scenario. For the British, it's great, because it means that they don't have to worry about the Pacific. For the Russians, it means that they probably find themselves facing some invasion into their eastern territories, with both the Americans and perhaps the Japanese joining in. It possibly leads to some very interesting versions of Arctic warfare. And it's probably not it's probably a war about the same length, but honestly, the Russians probably find themselves the last people standing, and they're going to find themselves facing all sorts of shortages, because the Russian industry was really not great. And what people often forget in World War II is it's not just tanks and the lorries which are supplied to Russia, and to raw materials, especially the high-grade aluminium. And it's the machine plant, and it's the stuff that's for the factories to allow them to build stuff, because they don't have enough of it. Yeah, there's a lot of things got to go on that happen. Outside is, if the fleet, what a follow to the fleet's all these questions. Presumably, Japanese would have hit the shore for infrastructure a lot. Would that have hurt the US more in the long run? Not really, because the Americans would just have to rebuild it. But basically, it's a case of neither really hurts the Americans that much, because they had the infrastructure to rebuild it. That's the problem. The Americans have the infrastructure to rebuild it. They have the depth of industrial might. That's the whole reason why the Japanese realized the attrition plan worked against Russia, because of the geographical and industrial limitations of Russia. It doesn't work against the British Empire, it doesn't work against America, because their infrastructure and their industrial limits are very, very different. You know, there's the fact that the fun thing I always see is, depending on what case you're making, i.e. the Germans were terribly unable to fight World War II. They tend to go, here is Germany versus the British Empire in total output. And then if you want to make the case of Britain was weak and shouldn't have fought, and was so much weaker than Germany, and Germany was so much better than Britain in World War II, they make it Germany versus Britain in terms of industrial output. And realistically, both of those scenarios are technically correct. But the Japanese realize that any scenario involving war versus them is going to be the entire British Empire. And the Germans like to believe it wouldn't be. But I'm never quite sure how they believe certain bits are going to opt out of it. It's more a hope. For some reason, they seem to believe that certain parts of the British Empire, and it's not even the part you think about. They don't think South Africa or India are likely to drop out. They think it's things like Canada and Australia, and it's to an extent it's a case of no, those are quite fighty parts, and they're also parts which really don't like mustachioed dictator types. And let's be honest, the Canadians, they're so nice, they occasionally need a release so they can start completing the Geneva checklist again, just to help them burn off the steam. It's so much repressed rage from all that niceness that, you know, sometimes it has to come out. Hey, I like how... Nice way, please note, as much as I like Habitual Line Crosser, I was making the Geneva jokes about the Canadians long before he was. I know I'm a historian, and I don't have a comedic bone in my body, but, you know, I'd just like to point out I was making them ages ago. I was making students laugh. Well, there again, my students always laugh at my jokes, but most students always laugh at their professors' jokes and lecturers' jokes. Mainly because I have to. Have the Germans met a comedian? That is an interesting question. They presumably have. Okay, now, can I just say this? Leslie's sending me pictures of bottles of a 1901 iron brew. This is the thing I have as my mods. My mods torture me. Does everyone else, you know... Yeah, I have mods which actively torture me. Who else has this cruelty? Pictures of 1901, bottles of 1901 iron brew. It's just cruelty. Look, I'll say this. In a nice way, when the Great Canadian Goose versus Emu War happens, all I pray is that humanity is sensible and gets out the frigging way, and no one tries to send in peacekeepers. Chandler Chandel. Okay, there's a question from that. The Keto Battalion are ordered to pay a friendly visit to Pearl Harbour without being spotted. How does Washington react once they dock alongside Battleship Row? Panic attack. Absolute panic attack. And that would have been in many ways the absolute boss diplomatic move, which no one would have done. But, yeah. Geese do have the advantage that they fly. What are you licking? Oh, your paw. Okay. But it would have been the absolute boss maneuver. It would have been the absolute boss maneuver. It would have been a case of, we've got a can we come into dock? We've come for a friendly diplomatic visit. Normally you announce such things a long time in advance, but, you know, maybe. Oh, your mummy has sent a note to you saying that she's in bed. Do you think it's bedtime, or are you staying here for more biscuits? Or are you waiting till exactly 10 o'clock and then you're going to start demanding to go to bed? How do I know you so well? How do I know you so well? Goodness gracious me. Revenge for the hours I spent trying to read Japanese text and translation. Oh, it gets better, my dear friend. I found out there was to give you more fun, while searching up ranks, I found out that the actual phraseology used for Mitsumasa Yonai in his ranking doesn't seem exactly... It has extra letters added on at certain points in his career. And I have no idea why. I'm trying to figure it out. It has extra things added onto the glyphs. Onto the kanji, that is. And the translations I've been using haven't been working it out properly. So yeah, that's a fun one I've got going on. It's always a fun one. It always is a fun one. Right, I'm keeping track of both sets so I can make sure I have the questions. Yes, Dave Harrison, and I do agree with Carver Gersberg. Some felines have a Dave Harrison. That is the case. Or the Cantana editions. They could be, but they don't look like them. So far, I found it in a couple of Japanese texts which have been sent to me, and I'm asking permission if I can pass them on, because they are pictures that someone has taken in an archive for me. Or rather, has taken in an archive for themselves, and they've generously loaned them to me. What's the triplets? How much more of the IJA were for war with the Allies compared to the Navy? Or were they pretty close in amount? This is the thing. It's actually pretty clear. It's actually, as I tried to explain it, the parties in Japan are, one group is for war because we're going to lose anyway, so we might as well go out swinging and try to win. And the other group are, we've already frigging lost, let's please not have a war. Neither side is for peace. Neither side thinks they're in a good position. Neither side is strictly speaking for peace, because the side which are for we don't want the war is because we've already lost, so we need to try and seek a better position in other ways by taking out smaller powers and strengthening ourselves, hence the war with China. And the other side are, we might as well go to war with these guys because we're going to lose by strangulation, or, strangulation, death by 1,000 cuts peacefully, or we can go out swinging. There's no one who's actively going, I want a war because I love war. It's all a case of, let's go to war because we might as well go out swinging if we're going to die anyway, or we don't want war because we're already gone. That's it. And there is the divine mission. You're missing the divine missionary group. Yeah, but there are them, but they are a very small faction in terms of their real power. In terms of their real influence. Yes, there is that group, but it's like there are some factions of the peace one. There is a part of the peace faction which honestly believe that because the Emperor is a living god, they will triumph anyway, so they need not have a war. They are a very small group. I have literally found one, and I cannot remember how to pronounce their name, one reference to them in one book over the years. It's just, yeah. Oh. Yeah, it's attached to the mid-ranks. You have some very interesting officers at the mid-rank in the Army and Navy. But I would also say one of the problems you have is that these factions are, to an extent, political factions. And the thing I always say about politicians is they, how do I put this way? Elect in rhetoric, govern in prose. Elect in rhetoric and govern in prose. Yeah, they lie. No, I'm not sure. I always wondered, why do ships have rigging have 3 masts and not more? There are actually ships which have more. Look up some of the clippers. Some of them have as many as 7 masts. It's just the balance of, how do I put this way? If you want to fuss with these things, and the amount of personnel you need to run them, etc., 3 works out about the right balancing point, especially on the larger ships, to be worth the cost, the time, and the effort to run them and install them. More than that adds to the complication of maneuvering the ship and organizing the ship, and adds to the personnel requirements, etc. So basically, it's a sweet spot. If Hawaii had kept its sovereignty and the US had no port in Hawaii, do you think the Japanese would have attacked the mainland or even bothered starting war? I think they'd have probably had to attack the Philippines because that's their only option within range. They might have gone for the mainland, but they also might have tried to invade. They might have. What the Japanese might have done is manufactured a reason to invade Hawaii. That's what they probably would do. Manufacture a reason to invade Hawaii to take it for themselves. To better position themselves for a potential war with Japan, because you have America. Because you have to remember, the Japanese-American relationship starts off with the Black Fleet and gets worse. At various points, it gets worse. Honestly, the Americans, to an extent, are. They're the original boogeyman as far as Japanese foreign policy is concerned. And the Americans don't do themselves any favors, because there are things like the racial equality clause that the Japanese wanted to stick in the Washington Naval Treaty, etc., which the Americans take great delight in shooting down to show their power. but they don't realize they are just adding in problems for themselves to deal with the Japanese. You know, they're building up problems in their relationships with the Japanese, and there's a fundamental misunderstanding of both nations of each other. The Americans don't realize how far they've backed the Japanese into a corner, and they think the Japanese are going to give in because they are backed into a corner. Fundamentally, the Americans, I would say the American approach to the Japanese is like they are a Native American tribe in many ways that was particularly violent and particularly fighty. That's how they're treating them. And they don't even remember their own lessons of what happens sometimes when you push those tribes and the upsets they can deliver. But yeah, if they'd had their sovereignty, I think you have Japan. You have Japan invade Hawaii and them fighting over that. Also, would Japan's adventures in China be more overlooked during Cold War with the rise of the communist power? Let me put it this way: if Japan had been fighting against not the Republican government, but the Kuomintang government, but fighting against the communist parts of China, and that had been the dominant power in China, and a communist China they've been fighting against, then they would probably have had a lot more support. It's kind of an interesting thing. If Japan had been fighting against communists, the odds are A, you find a legion from Italy and a legion from Germany there to back them up, and B, you would probably find that the British and the Americans would not be supplying them. They had enough issues with supplying the Republican Spanish, who were not communists but aided by communist powers. If they'd been actually a communist power, that would have been problematic. No, Fluff. I don't think she's come to collect you. No, I don't think she has. Sorry, Fluff. He's a good fluffy boy. He is a good fluffy boy. I'm actually going to take him to his bed. I'll be back in a second. He keeps looking at the door, and I know he knows he thinks it's bedtime. So I will be about 2 minutes. Come on, you. Hello? Can you go garden?
Yes, you can go garden.
You go garden first, and then bed. Garden? Garden.
Alexander, I don't think I've got Debbie's crate on securely. Well, and you have to be out the garden. He hasn't been in the garden.
Don't shout, I'm still alive. Don't shout, I'm still alive.
Yes, you're still alive. I'm still alive.
Okay, in the nicest way now. Then you just sort of thank you, sis. Ay, caramba, sisters. I don't know, sisters. The corgi was saying hello, yes. He hopes you all heard. Yeah, that was a fun. Ooh. So there's a whole discussion going on to windjammers, and that's all fun. But yeah, it's one of those interesting things in this whole scenario is that so much of the American intelligence problems are formed by their own domestic political fights for power, and you could argue that Turner was in some ways being set up to become the CNO by Roosevelt because he was very much Roosevelt's choice of naval officer and very much, to Roosevelt's taste. And then Pearl Harbour happens, and in many ways that's why Turner gets sent off where he does, to the Pacific. It's a nice safe position for him to be sent to. It's a nice position for him to be sent to. he can go and prove himself and get himself some glory and some honor back. But yeah, the decisions taken, the removal of Richardson is the big thing. Richardson was probably America's finest Japan expert, the best at reading the tea leaves when it came to the Japanese. And when he's removed as the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, he's removed because he's causing too much trouble. He's removed because he's using the access to the raw information to disprove the analysis coming out of Washington, which is being led by Turner, and is embarrassing the government because of it. And that's the problem. Polemus, how much do you think the US has changed over the years at reading the tea leaves? It ebbs and flows, okay? Sometimes it gets a lot better, and sometimes it gets a lot worse. All powers, all nations go through it in terms of reading the tea leaves and trying to work things out, because there are real issues. You have to balance your domestic issues with your foreign policy issues, with your conflict management issues. You have to manage your priorities and your budgets. And the thing I make the point of in terms of defense spending is, yes, it is kind of like insurance, but it's not like insurance. Insurance in terms of defense and international relations is alliances. You hope it will pay out when you need it, and in return, you are the insurance of those other powers. Your armed forces are like your fire service, your police force, and your ambulance service. When you need them, you really frigging need them. When you don't need them, life goes on. And in that scenario, the Navy is kind of like the ambulance service. They're always on duty. They're always doing something. I would say the Air Force is kind of like the police. They're often patrolling, and sometimes they have things they have to deal with. Sometimes they don't, but they're not constantly responding to crises, even in peacetime. The difference is the level of crisis they're responding to, rather than the situation. When we're talking about the army, they're the fire service. The nicest way, they're hanging out in the fire station or the barracks and training area. When you don't need them, they're sitting there. But when you need them, when there's a fire, you really want them to turn up quickly and be ready to go. You don't want it to be a case of, they'll be ready in about 2 years' time, or 2 weeks' time. You want them ready right now, because that's the fire right now. So, which is why you pay for them. Is why you have them. But when it comes to intelligence services and reading the tea leaves, that requires some deep-seated specialists. It requires some generalists to oversee them and try and keep track of everything, because the trouble is, the specialists can get so wrapped up in their specialism they can end up not seeing the wider context of what's going on, which is why you have the generalists. And you need people involved who are going to continually ask questions. They have to be asking questions. That is the basic point of intelligence. And the trouble for America is occasionally, and they suffer from this perhaps more than most because of their position, their confidence in their status and their exception, and rightfully they do have a level of exceptionism if you consider their power and status in the world. It's understandable, but that means that they can think that they can, instead of asking questions, they're proving answers, and that's a different approach. a discussion of the masts going on. Yeah, they did try 4 masts, but as I said, 3 masts was the sweet spot. It's kind of like if you want a ship which is going to operate around the world and be able to do the presence mission as well as do the war fighting mission in high-end levels, you're often looking at roughly 10,000 tons. Go look every ship from basically HMS Warrior onwards. Look at the criteria. We want something which is going to be a primary war fighting asset. Entry level for that position is roughly 10,000 tons. Global primary war fighting asset. Yep, roughly 10,000 tons. Let's see, any questions in the chat? Any questions? You all happy? Enjoyed tonight's video, I hope? Found it interesting? Hi, Wade. Big tracked amphibious vehicles are rarely needed, but when it comes, they are a must-have. Yes, they are. They are a lovely thing to have. Plus, they're fun to drive. They are fun to drive. With that being said, if there aren't any more questions coming in, I will do this. And I'll say thank you very much everyone for being here. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you had a nice time. As normal, I will be on Discord in a bit. I'm just going to go check on doggies and help out things. Next week's video is Arkansas and Isaac N. Brown. And it should be finished and recorded and all sorts set up for that tomorrow. That should be all done tomorrow. The Battle of Dunach is already uploaded. That was the 1499 battle where the Swiss get to go to war, and it's a fun thing. All I will say is look up Nicholas Conrad. He is a mayor of a small town in Switzerland, and he does some nasty things. Very capable. And yeah, we've got some fun coming along. Also, I'm taking suggestions for August the 12th, 16th, and September the 16th, and September the 23rd. Any suggestions you have for them, please put in comments below. Umog for the win. These are fun to drive. They are. Anyway, thank you very much to John Shea, Leslie, Paul, Raptorat, Calvin Gasberg, John Hegstead, Bomeo Boy, everyone who's been here on both channels. Thank you very much for chatting away, for being here. There will be brew ships on Sunday. There'll be some Twitch games, probably Saturday night, and there might even be some tomorrow evening. Depends when I finish the recording I'm doing with some very nice people. So we'll see that. And yeah, thank you everyone. Thank you everyone for your support. Thank you everyone for your likes, shares and subscriptions, all your super chats and super thanks. They really do mean a lot. They really do help the channel keep going. I have a very expensive book habit, which I don't seem to be able to cure in any way, shape or form. There doesn't seem to be a place you can go to get over a book buying habit. They have all these retreats you can go to for alcohol, for drugs, for all these things in space. But no one has a space to go for a book buying habit, especially not a history book buying habit. I can't think why, but they don't. But how well. So I will work with it as I do. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care, and hope you enjoyed.